What's up, guys, and welcome back to Meineck. If you guys are new here, then what's up? My name's Erica. Heya, how you doing? Today is a very exciting day because I am sitting with the first of my old professors from NYU. So today I'm speaking to Professor Peter Meineck, who taught me about ancient theatre back in my days at university. Now, Professor Meineck is an incredibly established individual. He is British by birth, but teaches and lives over in the US. He has an incredible story about how he came to classics, which I will let him explain in a second. However, he is most famous outside of the industry for his publications of various Greek plays, so translations of plays like Frogs most recently, as well as the Oresteia, Clouds, Wasps, Ajax, Electra. I mean, the list goes on. And he primarily focuses on bringing the ancient world into a modern light through various theatre companies, theatre shows, and initiatives around the US. So thank you, first and foremost, so much for coming on and for chatting with me, Professor Meineck. And I actually have a fun fact for you before we just jump over to you telling us about your classics background, because I always start these videos with asking people what their classics background is, because I think it's important to know the context with professors, with experts, with authors, you know, all of those people, where they came from, how they started classics, how they got into it. It's incredibly fascinating to me because at NYU, when I took your ancient theatre class, you started the first lecture of the semester by telling us your classics background. And I thought that was so cool, for one. And also it helped me really understand sort of where we went throughout the semester, you know, as we were talking about different plays and how they were staged and the theatre environments and all of that. I thought knowing your background also really helped me contextualize everything that we were discussing. And yeah, I just always thought it was really cool. So one, thank you for giving me my introduction for every single video. And two, do you mind now, please, sharing with all of us, sharing with my audience, what your classics background is and how you discovered the subject?
Yeah, so I guess I'm not really traditional in the way I became a classics professor. I grew up in South London from a working class family, but my mother was a teacher. She was a music teacher. And I was always interested in ancient history and always wanted to go and visit Roman villas and stuff. I was kind of a geek as a kid. And I actually worked on an archaeological dig when I was 9, actually, and I found like an amazing amphora, and that was very exciting for me. So I always wanted to be an archaeologist, actually, and then, you know, my sort of life took another turn, and I ended up wanting a military career, and to join the Royal Marines, which I did, and then my life took another turn when they kind of discovered my brain, and so I eventually got to university while being a Marine and while being in the Royal Marine Reserves in London. So that was like a really weird double life. And then when I had to choose a degree program, I kind of thought of archaeology. But I remember going to my interview at the Institute of Archaeology in London, and everyone was wearing white coats, which kind of freaked me out, right? Because it's a very scientific subject. And then there was a course at UCL, University College London, called Ancient World Studies, which was designed for people like me who had no Greek or Latin, and it was kind of an intensive course. And I loved UCL, and I loved the professors there, and so I went there, which was the best decision ever. I mean, who wouldn't love a university where the founder is stuffed and mounted and in a glass case, right? Jeremy Bentham. You know, Gandhi went to UCL. It's just a great school. So, and of course, it's a school that was founded to teach classics when it was really the subject of the Enlightenment, and it was kind of the first non-theological school in Britain. You know, the godless institution on Gower Street, and everywhere there's these murals of Homer and stuff, but in this very kind of progressive way. It's a very progressive school. First school to take Jews, first school to take women. I mean, just a fantastic place. So I got there, and it was very overwhelming for me. First in my family to go to university, and I was going to be, you know, I was interested in Rome and the military stuff and Latin, and had to do Greek. But then I had to take a Greek drama class, which I did not want to do. I had no real interest in the theatre at all. And Pat Eastling had come from Cambridge to be our professor of Greek. And she took one look at me. She said, you should study Aeschylus because he was a soldier like you. And I just didn't realize, right, that a poet could be a soldier. So that was like a light going off for me. And I just got sucked into Greek drama and became a Hellenist and killed myself in ancient Greek in 3 years, But by the end of it, I was as good as the kids who've been doing it from the age of 7 in their private schools, right? So because I really loved it, but it was hard. And then I also got involved in the theatre, the Bloomsbury Theatre, which is a professional theatre that's part of UCL. Another ex-Marine was working there as a techie, and he said, you should come and help. And I didn't really want to get involved. And he said, no, it's great fun. So I went to help as a techie, like building sets and stuff. And I had never really kind of met the kind of diversity that you get. And this is like the early 80s, right? So I'd never really been exposed to like gay people and revolutionary communists and like all these kind of crazy people who just kind of came together to like make this thing called a show. And I also, that was another epiphany for me. There's other ways to be a commando, right? You can be an artistic commando. So I loved the culture and the society of the theater. And I just got really bitten by the bug of just being in the theater and working there, but never as an actor, as a technician and as a producer and a director. So I had these kind of parallel interests. And then because I was a good climber, thanks to the Marines, I got a lot of work in the West End theater, because the first rule of theater is make yourself indispensable. And I used to be able to climb up to lights that nobody else could reach. And so I was working in the West End all through college. So that's really has been a reflection of my career since then. And also just to get people as passionate about this stuff as Pat Eastling did to me, right? And make it accessible and give it to everybody, because it's amazing stuff. So I think that's what I always do. I try and teach that moment. So anyway, that's my background.
And then you start Aquila Theatre in 1991. So do you want to tell the audience a little bit about what Aquila does? Because it does some incredible work.
Yeah, so my first theatre company was a group of UCL graduates who were older than me, called the London Small Theatre Company. And I didn't found that company. They were kind of this weird a cappella group, but I thought they'd be great to do an Aristophanes play. So we did Aristophanes Clouds and we toured it. I did in London, we toured it all over America. And we did a couple of Greek plays with them. And actually the director, Fiona Laird, went on to work at the National and have a wonderful career. And, like all college things, it eventually imploded, right? But I knew there was something there. I always wanted to do Greek drama in a way that what was happening in London at the time was when Greek drama was done, it was either really avant-garde, which is great, or it was kind of really stuffy, or it was in Greek, right? So I had been involved in founding the UCL Greek play, which was, we were going to do an annual student Greek play in English, and it was very popular. People wanted to see this stuff. So originally, I founded Aquila to do Greek drama and to tour it all over Europe and in England and in America. And I think Agamemnon was our first performance, because I remember we had Laurence Olivier's daughter, Julie Kate Olivier, playing Cassandra, and everywhere she went, it was like, come and see the daughter of the greatest actor ever. This poor girl, how you follow that, I don't know. She was wonderful though. But there was a real audience for this stuff. We did Sophocles' Ajax, and then we did this weird, wacky Aristophanes play, Wasp, with 4 actors. It was very Rocky Horror. We could not get away with this show now. It was like the guy who played the chorus had a super soaker and would like soak the audience if they didn't do all the audience. I mean, it was really rude and but it was this. It became this like cult show that people wanted to see in America in the 90s. And so Aquila started to grow, and then we started to do Shakespeare. And Coriolanus was our first, being kind of a Roman play. And funnily enough, coming to Shakespeare after a few years of doing Greek drama, Shakespeare just felt really modern and easy. And so actually in America, we built up a reputation for Elizabethan theater. We built up a very strong reputation for doing kind of really bold, kind of cheeky interpretations of Shakespeare. And we had a lot of success in New York. But our first breakout show in New York was, funnily enough, a production of Book 1 of the Iliad, which sounds really obscure. Yeah, which we used Stanley Lombardo's translation, and we kind of realized you can't stage the Iliad. So we said, what would happen if a group of the cover of Stanley Lombardo's Iliad, which I was involved in, is a famous D-Day photograph called Into the Jaws of Death, which is a group of GIs coming off a landing craft. He said, well, what would happen if those GIs found themselves in like a basement of a bombed out house with some civilians and some enemy soldiers? And in order to not kill each other, they just started to tell the story of the Iliad. So we did this production, and we did it at this studio at Lincoln Center, and it was huge. We got these fantastic reviews, and everybody, all these stars wanted to see the show. We thought, we've made it, right? This is fantastic. And of course, you know, as soon as the show closes, everybody forgets you. But it did create a momentum for what we were doing with Aquila. And so, yeah, since then, Aquila has developed this very large American tour, goes to about 50 cities a year, goes all over the country, does a lot of stuff in New York. And then the other thing it does is it's developed a lot of quite groundbreaking public programming where we use Greek drama, and we work with veterans, and we work with the refugee community. So there's kind of an applied aspect to it. And now Aquila's 35 years old, and it's a professional company, and they're out right now touring. I just came back from seeing them. So it's amazing. I never thought it would, last this long, actually.
Well, working with veterans and with refugees, that's some incredible work that you do. Like, I really got bogged down in my research for this, and seeing all the productions and the different types of productions, I think, is the key, because you do some reading where you have people read, and then you have more so actually like stage productions that you do with them. And something that you've said quite a bit is how much you've learned from the refugees and from the soldiers or the ex-soldiers taking on these plays. Is that something that you anticipated as being in the military, even though you weren't in active service yourself? Yeah. Did you anticipate learning so much from them when you would give them these plays?
I think so. I think so, because particularly when we started with Vietnam vets and even some World War II vets, right? It was going back a few years now. Is, the kind of Latin word for veteran implies an experience. So right from the start, there was a sense with the program that what was out there was very little out there at the time for veterans, but what there was definitely, with the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, there was definitely, and we started the program when these wars were going on, and the veterans from those wars weren't quite ready to speak about it yet, right? But it had definitely triggered the Vietnam, Korean War, World War II vets, Cold War vets, right? So they definitely had a lot to say and responded to this material in a way that really surprised me. And they taught me things. They heard things that I had not heard before, whether it was the Odyssey or Iliad or any of these plays. And so the program was always kind of, we're not talking down to you, or it's not what the vets call trauma porn, right? We're not going to keep going on about PTSD, even though that's a real thing for some people, not just veterans, right? We actually want this program to be about creating a dialogue between you guys and the civilian population. So there's a value, right? And I think one of our founding vets, Brian Dellett, who served in Vietnam as a professional actor, he said this program is about literacy, making Americans literate about war and the cost of war. So if you vote for people who are going to send you to war, you need to understand what that means, right? And I always thought that was really profound. And in a way, I felt that's what Greek tragedy was doing as well, right? It was laying out what the cost of this is, even though it was maybe an inevitability in the ancient world, maybe even still today. Understanding in the democracy what it means to send men and women, and also what it means to that population. That was the value of that program. But also, I've learned massive amounts about this stuff from them.
Well, I was listening to one of your many lectures that are on YouTube. I don't want to terrify you, but there are a lot on YouTube, which is great for me because it means I get to watch them for free. But you referenced a book, which was Achilles in Vietnam, if I'm not mistaken, by Jonathan even, M.D. Shea. And he said Greek drama was written by combat veterans, performed by combat veterans, for an audience of combat veterans. So in a way, like what you're doing is kind of putting that back to the people. So then I guess communicate it to people like me who might not have picked up on certain things.
Yeah, and I met Jonathan Shea right around the time he was working that book years ago. And, you know, funny enough, Shea's been kind of roundly misunderstood by classicists who think that he's saying that the Iliad and the Odyssey and Greek drama is exactly the same in terms of kind of PTSD than today. That's not what he was saying at all, right? If you actually read the books, he was a clinical psychologist working in the VA who found that this material could draw useful analogies with what he was finding. But that kind of and there's another scholar, Larry Treitel, who at the same time had served in Vietnam, and he wrote his book From Milos to My Lai, and he goes right out there and says, no, I can absolutely see this stuff in this work. And that's interesting, right? Because I don't know why that's controversial, right? Maybe it's because it's sort of somehow setting up this idea that, you know, the Greeks are a lot more like us than we care to think, even though it's a completely different culture. But there are many of my colleagues who really don't like this view of antiquity and really don't like veterans actually kind of commenting on the material, which I find very, very strange, right? I don't know what that's provoking in them. But of course, right, is that human beings involved in anything traumatic are going to have certain responses. Those responses are going to be different and they'll be handled differently by that culture, but the basic biology is the same. So I think we underestimate the impact of wars and enslavement and, you know, what the Greeks called anthropodismos, right, which is the kind of sorting and selling of people. I think we underestimate how traumatic that was. And also, I always think about Aeschylus, right, and that his father would have never known these kind of wars. And all of a sudden in the 5th century, Persian War onwards, you've got like really colossal wars happening where, you know, to the point where the Athenians have to abandon their city for 2 years and live as refugees, right? So of course that has an impact in the material. But there is a resistance, I think, sometimes in some of my colleagues in thinking about it in those terms. And there's also a resistance in many British colleagues in even dealing with the whole concept of combat trauma, like somehow it doesn't exist. Well, it does, right? So I think now, in a way, our work has fed into this kind of new thing coming from veterans, which is to say, if you send young people into traumatic situations, guess what? They're going to be traumatized. So rather than seeing it as a disorder, right, which it needed to be to get the funding and treatment it needed, maybe we need to understand that has to be part of how we deal with our military veterans and populations affected by war. Is that, you know, it's a life of treatment and having to understand that these things probably should be traumatic, right? Because they are. And I think the Greeks knew that, right? I think you just got to read the Odyssey to see that that's what Homer's telling us right there.
Well, it's funny. So my brother is actually a member of the National Guard in the US, and I did a video series on my channel, which was chapter by chapter breaking down the Iliad. So just every week I would just tell people what happened. And sometimes I'll throw in these jokes, and then I would, you know, talk to my family about them. And sometimes I would say things to my older brother, who is an active serviceman, and he would be like, oh, well, that's not really it, because he had read it and he understands it on a level that even though I poke jokes at some things, which again, it's all done in good humor, I'm not laughing at anybody, but he will even say like, oh, make sure next time you mention this thing or this thing, because other soldiers will get this a lot more, even reactions to things I think are silly. He notices so much more than I do, even though I'm the trained classicist.
No, that's absolutely right. And I remember working on Sophocles' Philoctetes, and that play just came to life in that it wasn't a philosophical play for veterans. It was a play about leadership and ethics and morality, and the officers who were in the program really got into debates with each other, and then with the enlisted men and women, right, about, you know, what Odysseus was doing in that play and if it was justified, and, you know, lying and making kind of life and death decisions. And so, yeah, they kind of they see these things as like living works, which is so exciting. So yeah, I mean, one really profound example was when we were working with refugee teens at NYU, our program there, we were working on Aeschylus's suppliant women. The suppliant girls, really. I mean, they're like 13, 14 years old. And, so here's a story of these girls who are fleeing forced marriages. There's a lot more going on, but that's the basic idea, which seems such an abstract concept. And then after 3 days, one of the participants in the program said, "This is unbelievable. This is my story." She was from Azerbaijan, and she was at 13 about to be married off to a 40-year-old man she'd never met before. And her mother decided, "I'm not having this." So they fled, right? And that's why she ended up, via Russia, actually, in New York City. And this story was incredibly real for her. It was her story. And you suddenly go, wow, right? These things are happening in parts of the world and mean something. So yeah, and that, now I'm learning from this young woman. She's now 17, and she's got so much to teach me about what this play means. So yeah, you do. You experience these things through people who've experienced similar things that the plays are communicating, and that just gets us out of our heads, right? And it gets us out of the classroom or the book, and you start to experience these plays again as pieces of live theater.
Now, the reason why I did call you on this channel, we do have to switch gears slightly, is because I'm dying to talk about your translations. Because I spoke to Stephanie McCarter. She just published a translation of Ovid's Metamorphoses. It kind of got me down this rabbit hole of the art of translation. So just right off the bat, as a translator yourself, what is it that draws you to translating plays in particular? Are you thinking of doing that as an exercise for yourself? Are you thinking of adding to the already existing, translations out there? Or is it more so as somebody who's so into theater that you're like, oh, I bet you I can do this blueprint text better or different or in a new way?
Yeah, originally it was to create translations for Aquila for two reasons. One, because I wasn't that I felt other translations were bad. Some are, but translations are developed for a purpose, right? So you have cribs, right, which we all use, which, like you might say the excellent Arison Phillips series, right, which are brilliant cribs, but they're unperformable because they're not supposed to be performance text. They're trying to find English idioms that's as close as possible to the Greek, which is very difficult, right? Then you have, poetic translations, right? I would put like Robert Fagles in that category, and I've used some of his work, and he was a wonderful, generous scholar, and I knew him. But these translations are almost too poetic for the stage, right? You almost get lulled by the beauty of them. So I started to do them because I wanted a kind of specific tone for the work that I was doing. And I also felt that the rehearsal process itself was a really great next step, right? So I'll give you an example. I remember one of the first things I translated arrogantly was Aeschylus's Agamemnon, because I always had this affinity with Aeschylus, I still do, which is a tough mountain to climb, right? And I remember working in rehearsal, and the actor playing Clytemnestra, she said, look, why is it that I'm really careful that everything I say is actually truthful? And then this scene here, when the messenger comes in and I tell him that I've been faithful to my husband, that's clearly a lie, right? And everybody knows that. Why am I lying here, right? And this is what actors will do, because they actually have to say these lines and make them work. And I had to go back, right, and really look at what the Greek was doing. And it made me realize that Aeschylus had created this beautiful language where you could interpret this one line in three completely different ways, right? And that was the beauty of it. And I think actors will do that, right? They'll push these challenges back at you, and then you can hear it in the space and go, does that work? Does that not work? So that's how I started with my own translations. And I think even now, the last one I did was Frogs. Even then, I finished the translation, and I really wasn't happy with it, because I felt like I wouldn't want. Where's the show, right? Where's the fun? Where's me in this, right? So I actually went back and I decided I'm going to throw out all the choruses, and I'm going to do what Aristophanes did. I'm going to parody music, right? And I thought to myself, this is kind of my process. I thought, well, what would the initiates be singing today, right? What would initiates be singing? It's they're full of, they're dead, right? They're in the underworld, but they're full of joy. What is that? And of course, you know, I grew up in the 70s and 80s, so I instantly went to kind of like, you know, R&B and soul music and Earth, Wind and Fire and all these incredible bands who were playing this kind of spiritual, joyful, gospel, funk infused music. And I'm like, that'd be fun if that was a show. I'd actually enjoy that on stage. And so I started to use that kind of music. I used like AC/DC. I used to work for AC/DC as a roadie. I used AC/DC. I used Bruce Springsteen. And I guess I was also riffing on classic, right? Is that, well, these are classics too. And this felt very Aristophanic. And then the final kind of song that's actually sung by Aeschylus, but he's parodying Euripides. I thought, well, what was so clever about Euripides, right? Why is Euripides so kind of regarded as so out there? And I thought to myself, you know, I'm going to go to Wu-Tang Clan, and I'm not a hip hop aficionado at all, but I have a program in Frederick Douglass Academy in Harlem, a Shakespeare program. Those kids have taught me so much about their history of oratory, right? All the way back, through jazz and slave spirituals and back to West Africa, but all the way through to hip hop, right? And they're classicists in their own sense. So they're telling me about Wu-Tang, and I'm reading the lyrics, and it's poetry, right? It's amazing. And I'm like, oh, this is Euripides. So I translated Euripides as a Wu-Tang Clan song, thinking this is going to definitely upset a lot of classicists, but actually people seem to quite enjoy it. And I kind of think now that anybody who picks up a translation by me, if I don't actually push the envelope a little bit, they're going to be a bit disappointed. I kind of feel like I have to bring that theatricality. So ultimately, I'm always thinking, what would I want to put on stage, right? What would I enjoy? What's truthful to me, right? And that's how I try and produce a translation. And hopefully people want to pick it up and go, oh, this has got some energy, right? This feels like a play that needs to be staged and not like something to be studied in a classroom. It can be, right? Or just a poem. So yeah, definitely my theatrical sensibility comes into play.
Well, one thing I also want to say, just as like a little note that I was just thinking then, that I was like, I should probably say this. Even when I took your class, you don't tell your students to get your plays. And I think that's really important, because I think a lot of professors do that. And like, well, at least when I was taking the class, you were just so encouraging to pick up any translation of the play and whatever worked for us. And I remember some of us would bring in these wacky old translations we would find in like the Strand, or like some weird sort of, you know, secondhand bookshop that it was like, I just found this one. And they were all so different and so like in their own ways. But one thing I always wonder is like, as a translator, when you do have to separate from the Greek and from the original language, you know, to do fun things like bring in music or whatever, is there part of you that kind of feels guilty from pulling away from the ancient stuff? Or is it also necessary to pull it forward, to do it differently and to invigorate it for a new audience?
Well, that's a good question, right? Because I always feel the more you study these plays and the more you know them, the more radical you're going to be. And I think most, you know, I have a whole thing about the way Greek drama is taught in drama schools. Is it's over reverence, like we're doing the Greeks, and everybody suddenly forgets all of their acting instincts and do this thing I call the Greek play walk, right, where they do this very solemn, very slow-mo walk, and it's like, what are you doing? It's like, and I want to jump on stage and go, well, what are you feeling here? And what, you know, and it's like, why is it that we just, you know, over ritualize Greek drama? So I'm not running the museum, right? I'm running the theater company, and I'm trying to move you. So, and I've come to the conclusion with tragedy that actually you have to radically rework it to the point where the audience aren't even aware they're watching a Greek play anymore, right? They just need to be like watching this incredible story about a family and get pulled into it. And then maybe later they go, oh, wow, that was Medea or that was Agamemnon, because I think it gets in the way, right, of a great show. And I think we can be over reverent with that material. I definitely should never direct Aeschylus because I'm over reverent to it, right? It needs to be given to somebody who can be radical with it and find out what it is that propels it. So, but that's a very different artistic agenda, than producing a translation that is then going to be studied. So what happens, I publish mine with Hackett, which are a wonderful press, and they always encourage me to within 5 lines to be line for line with the Greek, right? Because that's important to me. And so I definitely still try and do that, right? I'm still trying to, so a student can give a line reference and go look up the Greek if they want to, or look it up in another translation and go, oh, okay, I see what's going on here. And I do think you can make ancient references work as well. I think a good director and actors can take a reference. I remember in this famous production of Wasps, there's all these references to Cleon, right? The sort of demagogic politician of the kind of late 5th century. And we were like, what do we do with this, right? And I remember the chorus leader just came out and just said, every time I say the word Cleon, you will, to the audience, you will all stand up and chant Cleon. And if you don't, I'm going to get you my stinger, right? My super soaker. And of course, the first time I did, they didn't. So we soaked them all. So very quickly, the entire audience, every time they heard Cleon, were standing up and going, Cleon. So they inherently knew that they were being manipulated by this person. We never had to give a footnote or explain it. So I think you have to let artists kind of have that fun. And then some of my best artists, sometimes working on, like, say, Philoctetes or Ajax, sometimes they'll go, we just have to make this work, right? And that what seems strange or otherworldly or odd is actually gold, right? And we need to make this work. And sometimes that challenge of trying to make something work and not just throw it out, that's where the beauty is. That's where the mystery is of this stuff. And sometimes you don't have to explain it all, right? Sometimes it can just be ancient, just like, Sophocles is telling you a story that was ancient to his audience, right? So there's a weirdness to this material. That's okay, actually. There is an otherness that sort of makes it work. And I think that allows you as an audience to kind of step back for your own here and now, and then draw different analogies. So you're not always just updating for the sake of updating. And I love to hear the names of all these ancient places and all these Greek cities. And I mean, you take a play like the Persians and you just travel around the world in that play, right? So the Greeks themselves are really, well, I say the Athenians themselves are really interested in where they fit in to the wider Mediterranean world. And we tend to not look at the Greeks like that. We think of the Athenians as kind of somehow inventing all this stuff out, and they didn't, right? They were influenced by what was around them, and you see that in the plays. So there's a strangeness even to them in what they're traveling through, experiencing their plays, and we can too. So yeah, strangeness is good sometimes.
Well, a strangeness that I had to ask you about with translating is jokes, because obviously you just did Frogs.
Yeah,
it's a comedy, and sometimes these ancient jokes are a little funky because the language doesn't directly translate. There are lots in Aristophanes that people are still like, well, we think we know what this means and we think it's a reference. Lots in Lysistrata that people still don't really know what those are about. So I'm wondering, from a translator's point of view, with jokes in particular, when you know that you're hitting a punchline, but the punchline is weird, what do you do in those situations?
Yeah, so I think a couple of things, right? The one thing that I do change is there are, in particular in Aristophanes, there are jokes in Aristophanes that don't comport with our taste, right? So there are jokes that we would, jokes based around pederasty or even pedophilia that, none of us want to put on stage, right? For obvious reasons. And I think you do have to like throw those out, right? And, and I think there's a lot of misogyny, and you can definitely, although actually less in Greek drama than some modern plays, but you can go either way with that stuff, right? I mean, you can play it and have a comeuppance and see the ridiculousness of it, which I think is a lot of what Aristophanes is doing. I think that I tend to look for what is the intention and objective of the joke, right? And then I will translate the objective. Because I think my process is not, I'm not just translating words, right? The words are only 25% of the total experience of going to the theater, right? So what's happening visually, right? What's happening with props, what's happening with the body, what's going on stage, right? So I think that I try and find the objective of that joke and then say, well, if I just translate that joke straight, that's not going to work, right? So let's actually find an equivalent to that joke that has the same objective. And I think we've had quite a lot of success with that. I think you let actors ad lib as well, right? I think you can use the audience a lot and bounce off them, which Aristophanes does all the time. And I think in performance, it's about kind of what works. And then we've allowed ancient jokes just to be obscure and have the actors like refer back to it, like say the joke and then we'll look at each other, go and shrug, right? And that in itself is funny because we're all in on the joke of we don't really understand this stuff. I think when you find a joke like that you don't understand, it's probably hilarious, right? And so culturally specific that we're never probably really going to get it, right? So for me, in a printed translation, you know, if I change a joke, I'll put the original one in the footnote so people can see it. On stage, obviously, I'm not going to do that, right? It's like this has to work and it has to be funny. And if it's too obscure, you're not going to get it. What is remarkable is how many, once you understand the objective of an Aristophanic joke, how many of them work, right? How many of them are Schadenfreude? How many of them are just like basic elements of comedy? We haven't really changed what we laugh at, right? You know, at the end of the day. I mean, like I said, my original production of Wasps from the early 90s probably couldn't go on stage today because sensibilities change, right? And then the same in 30 years. So now we're going back 2,500 years. But the basic dynamics of comedy are pretty similar, actually. Yeah.
Now, the idea of staging things just reminded me of something that you had said in another one of your talks, which you also actually, to be fair, did say in our lectures at NYU as well. And I just thought it would be such a fun fact to sprinkle in here because all of my viewers tend to be complete newbies to classics, which is what I love and adore in opening them up to this world. But the original Theatre of Dionysus, I think it was, actually isn't in this shoehorn shape that we all, you know, associate with theatre of the ancient world. And that to me was always really fascinating, that you said it was actually straightforward seating. Do you want to explain that a little bit more? Because I think everybody has this idea of the orchestra in the middle and people sitting around.
Yeah, well, there's been the last 10 years, there's been some really great work led by Christiana Papastabadi von Mook, and she's found some amazing archaeological evidence. First of all, the theatre was not 20,000 seats in the 5th century. It was probably 5,000. That's still a big space, right? Most Broadway houses are maximum 2,000 seats. Wooden benches, no circular orchestra, and probably it starts to come round on 3 sides in the 5th century, but straight, right? So you don't get this kind of semicircular theatre with the circular orchestra. We don't see that until Epidaurus, and Epidaurus is not a theatre, right? There's no evidence of any theatrical performances ever being performed at the theatre at Epidaurus, right? So it's a theatrical space, but it's probably for sound and for healing and for chorality and spoken word. And it's definitely, you know, Epidaurus is built on kind of Pythagorean mechanisms, and it's a wonder. But Epidaurus was found first, right, in the 1860s. So that I mean, it's beautiful, right? That becomes the standard. So then when they excavated Theatre of Dionysus, that's what they had in their head. So they were desperately trying to make the archaeology fit the circle. It's just not there, right? But then by the end of the 4th century, when Lycurgus rebuilds the theatre, you know, they're influenced by Epidaurus. Now you're starting to get the circular orchestra, the stone theatre. But the theatre of Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, and Aristophanes did not look like that at all, right? So I always say it's about the environment, right? It's about going up onto that hillside and looking out into that incredible view and being in the open air and the sky space and feeling like you're up in the heavens and you're getting all this dopamine, right? And you're having your mind opened. It's not about the architecture. That is not. And that's why in the 5th century, nobody says, I'm going to the theatre. And we never hear the term theatre of Dionysus. We hear the term sanctuary of Dionysus. And you say, I'm going to see a chorus. That's what you would say. So we don't actually have the term theatre of Dionysus until the end of the 4th century. So, yeah, if you look at the evidence that we have, it's a much simpler setup. Doesn't mean that the plays were simple, but it's much more about the body, about the chorus, about music, about dance, about the masks, and less about all the kind of paraphernalia that we might come to associate with a theatrical experience. I think it would have been way more exciting. I mean, you weren't allowed up onto the Acropolis except maybe at the Panathenaea, right? The annual festival to Athena, the big one every 4 years, and the Dionysia. So it was a cool experience.
I have 2 questions leading off of that, but we'll do the first one, which is going back to what you were saying about the environment. Because I watched one of your lectures that was all about, because you're also a cognitive theorist on top of doing all of this, but about how when you like lift your eyes, it releases dopamine and how that would have played a role in the theatre. So being a cognitive theorist and thinking about how the mind also and the environment impacts plays and impacts performance, did that change the way that you approach performance now, knowing all of that would have been at play with the ancient plays during the time, and now that you put on ancient plays, is that something you actively think about, or not really, because it's not really a thing in modern theatre?
The reason I turn to cognitive theory is because I think that cognitive theorists are interested in experience, right? And I wanted a way to write about the theatre that was not about literature, which is not theatre, or about archaeology, which is not theatre, but it's about experience. What's happening to you when you watch these plays? And cognitive theorists, they deal with this, right? And they have a language to write about it. And several people in the theatre world have worked on this. I'm probably the first in the ancient theatre world to work on it. But there's more and more classicists now turning to cognitive theory, because also it creates a theoretical framework for me to step back and get out the 21st century, right? And think more clinically about the ancient world. But now, definitely, I'm more aware of it in rehearsal. I'm more aware of it with the actors. And so much of what actors do, the good ones, right, is they inherently kind of know this stuff, right? Or they've been taught it, or they understand it. But also we have found it's quite useful sometimes to use some of it, kinesthetic empathy and emotional contagion and the way gestures work. And if we're working with masks, definitely we found it useful. And it's kind of come into the work as well. And I wouldn't say it's necessarily changed it, but I think it's emboldened it. And it's given us a language. When new actors come into the company, it's given us a language to say to the actors, hey, this is what we're doing. And this is what's happening. And I think that always helps, right? You don't want to get too theoretical in rehearsal, but a little bit of that. Like, for example, if I'm auditioning actors, I always get a mask out and I put masks on actors because, as Oscar Wilde said, you give someone a mask and they show the truth, right? And you put a mask on an actor and you start to see them, right? I mean, it's uncanny. You really see them, right? You get beyond the hours and weeks of their audition practice that they've been doing, and you see their body and you start to have this kinesthetic response to it one way or another. So that's definitely come out of my research on masks. So yeah, I think the two things definitely come together. And it also makes us think about space and why some spaces work and why some spaces don't work. I think we've got much better at figuring that out. And I think that feeds into how we design shows, particularly touring shows, and what we use in them. Yeah, so I think it probably has fed back into the work.
And also, that answer perfectly ties into what my original second question was this idea of like performance being just a part of the ancient society, because you mentioned going up to the Acropolis for the Panathenaic Festival. It's also a note, I found my old notebook from your lectures back at NYU, and that was like a recurring like thing that I was writing in, was how religion was also performance. And obviously people on this channel, you guys have watched my Iliad and Odyssey series, so you know about the bards and all of that, that's also a level of performance. And I guess in modern day we don't have that sort of part of society that's always performing. Or do you think that we do, maybe, and I just totally misinterpreted that, but I would say that we kind of tend to stick to these lanes of like, you read, you study, or you do this, or you sit in a lab and you blah, blah, whereas the ancients were much more fluid with that sort of stuff. So that was probably, I assume, a benefit to their theatre experience as well, that all of them in a way were also actors and writers and all of that.
Yeah, I mean, everything was performed in antiquity, right? I mean, everything that happened outside the house was performed. Politics was performed. The law courts were performance. Everything was read out loud, right? And we've professionalized performance, right? So we have priests, we have actors, we have professional musicians, and we become a bit more passive in the way that we consume that. Now, performance theorists would actually push back and say, no, we're everything's performing, the way we dress, the way we do our hair, the way we interact. And yeah, they're right at that level. But I think there's a formality of performance that is baked into the ancient world. And as classicists, of course, we're trained to value the text. Now, thank goodness we have the text, right? Because there's an enormous amount of information there. But, you know, that they're in a way recordings of performance or scripts for performance, right? Even though, you know, by the Hellenistic period and during the Roman period, you've got people consciously writing. They're consciously writing to the point where they're going to read this out to an audience, right? And that is a very different engagement with a text than sitting alone and reading it. I mean, you know, Lycurgus in the 4th century BC decides that he wants to control the works of, you know, Athenian drama. So he gets them written down. They're written down, you know, 150 years later. And then if you want to perform them, you've got to come to the library and consult the librarian. So you do like the official version, but you don't get to take the papyrus scroll home. The librarian reads it to you and you have to remember it, right? So I think that's a really great and inactive way to think about the text, right? Is that the text is just like an exogram, right? It's a way to offload your memory onto something else and increase your memory, but it's still a memory device for it to be performed. And ancient Greek is such a performative language, right? The words often sound like the thing that's being described and works on all these levels and ironies. So yeah, I mean, it's very much a performance culture. And I think sometimes we misunderstand that. But I think most of my colleagues would agree with that, right? That all this stuff is being put out there. And I see more and more PhD students now working with performance theory and thinking about these things. And I think that's very exciting. And we're seeing really kind of exciting work coming down the pipe now in ancient studies, actually, more and more. I think the one thing that I'm working on right now, I don't know if this is relevant, is I'm trying to reframe ancient performance. And instead of believing that all theatre starts with the Greeks, understand that Athenian Greek drama was completely informed by a whole ancient world around it, including Africa, which is half of the Mediterranean, which people forget, the Near East, Europe. There were all these existing performative traditions. And actually, the Greeks tell us this, right? You know, Aeschylus tells us this, Herodotus tells us this. It's all there if we just listen to the Greeks. So I'm now working on a project where, you know, what's Carthaginian theatre, what's Phoenician theatre, what's Numidian drama, right? And what's Egyptian drama? What are all these different influences? And trying to kind of set them side by side. And in a way, I think that will make what Aeschylus and Euripides and Sophocles did even kind of more exciting, because we'll see how they took from that and pushed it even further. And so that's I think a whole new area to kind of equalize the ancient world. So we're not just talking about the Greeks and Romans, right? As they didn't, right? They never saw themselves as, you know, one thing. So that's kind of where my head is right now in everything that I'm doing.
Is that specifically theatre or sort of all kinds of performances, like, you know, art or religious performance or?
Yeah, so, you know, again, I think the word theatre, we got to give it back to the Greeks. I think what we do now is so far away from what the Athenian audience were seeing, that they wouldn't recognize it as what they called theater, right? They would go and watch, as Herodotus did, or reports that he did, would go and watch a ritual performance in Egypt and see that as much closer to the Oresteia as if they went to see a Albee play today on Broadway, right? They'd be like, oh, you're just kind of talking a book, right? Okay. So, yeah, I mean, I definitely think that performance studies and cognitive theory are giving us tools to read cultures beyond the text. And I think one of the ways that we do that is through their material culture evidence and through their performance traditions. And I think that can help us equalize the ancient world. So classics becomes a much broader field. And this is my big push to kind of really invigorate classics, is that, you know, we've all got classics in our past, wherever we're from. Let's start talking about them all and how there was a meshwork, right? A network of connectivity between all throughout the Mediterranean, up and down the Nile, across the Silk Road. This is very, very exciting. So ultimately, I'd love to see a classics department be the biggest department at a university with, you know, 100 scholars around a table who are all studying these ancient cultures. And that's where I'd love to see it go. So in a way, that's kind of one of my agendas with this project. But also, I just think we would understand Greek drama much more deeply if we can root it in its context.
That sounds fascinating. That sounds really, really interesting. But since it's been nearly an hour of us talking, the note that I always end on with all of my guests, because again, all of my viewers are newbies, and I always ask professors and very esteemed classicists like yourself, speaking to those people who maybe I get a lot of people who discover classics later in life and are coming to try and get some help to read these texts, or students who are at university and need to read the text and are struggling with them. What's the advice that you would give to newbies who are sort of, they want to dip their toes into classics, they're finding it quite unapproachable? What's like a little pep talk, or just, you know, something that you can give them that will sort of help them along the way?
I'd say two things, right? If you can, you have the means, go to Greece and Italy, or Spain, or Northern Africa. Go there, right? And when you go there, it will make sense, right? When you go there and you sit in the landscape, you'll feel it and you'll understand it. And go there and read the Aeneid or read parts of the Odyssey and just smell the smells and drink some Retsina if you're old enough, and 18 in Europe, and, you know, eat the food, and you'll see that kind of continuity, this kind of wisdom of the ancestors that's being passed down. If you can't do that, I think the key is to find a translation that speaks to you, right? And there's many out there. And to actually, if you're waiting for a translation, you don't understand it, throw it away and get one that does speak to you and does move you, and find that connection and that kind of human connection of what this work's trying to say. And at the end of the day, right, that work is being done for people like you to move you and to make you feel something. So it's not that complicated on that level to understand this material and to have an opinion about it, right? And your opinion is in a way that initial reading you're going to have and the thoughts you have about that play or that ancient text, it's really valuable, and you have something to contribute. So I think the trick is not to get overwhelmed by it, not to think, oh, I need to know ancient Greek or I need to learn all this history. I think if you're fascinated by the work, you'll do that because you want to, right? But I think ultimately, you know, don't be afraid to be moved by it, because this is in a way the wisdom of ancient people, one ancient people, right, that is lucky enough to come down to us, and it still has something to say to us today, for sure.
I could not agree with that more. Something I constantly say on this channel is that the point of the plays, the books, all of this was to entertain you. It's a story, so find one that is entertaining, and it's okay to have emotions in response to it, or to find one that maybe isn't the one you're studying in class, because if it entertains you, that was the goal.
Yeah. And within Greek literature and even Roman literature is everybody, right? Everyone's there, all ethnicities, all cultures, every gender. It's all there, right? If we scratch away a lot of the kind of elitist and racist ideas about classics in the 19th century, but we actually go back to antiquity, and there were problems back then too. you see yourself reflected in these texts, and I think it's for everybody. As I say, the Mediterranean world was, a fascinating, interconnected, intercultural place, and these classics texts reflect that.
Well, that seems like the perfect place to end this, actually. That was a really lovely note. I'm really sorry, guys. I know that you probably were really enjoying that conversation, but alas, we only have so much time to do these interviews in. So first and foremost, thank you so much, Professor Meineck, for sitting down and for chatting with me. And thank you guys so much for watching this video. Thank you guys so much for supporting the channel, subscribing, because it allows me to have these conversations that I think are really beneficial for everybody with regards to the ancient world. Now, if you guys are super interested in buying any of Professor Meineck's translations of Greek plays, or watching any of his lectures that I've been referencing throughout this whole talk, everything is in the description below. Okay, so just go down there, check it out. You can find Professor Meineck's socials as well. He's on Twitter, and a couple of other videos that he did for Vanity Fair, which was really fun. So you guys should definitely go and check those out, all in the description below. So thank you guys so much, and we'll be seeing you next time with more videos here on Meineck. So I'll see you guys then.